Turn on the television, turn on the radio, the World Cup is just about to begin. Everywhere there is trivia, everywhere there is celebration of the majority, everywhere there is celebration of the desire for us all to embrace and become one world together. I met somebody recently who said, I don't want to be English. He said, I don't want to be British. He said, England's a puddle, he said. I want to step out. He said, I want to be a citizen of the world. I don't want to have a race. I don't want to have a kind. I don't want to have a group, even a class. I don't want to come from anywhere. I want to be on this planet. This planet is my home. Well, my view is that sort of fate universality. Maybe he should get in one of these little dinky rockets and fire himself off into some other firmament. Because this is the home that we have and know. And the only reason that we can define it as such is by virtue of the diversity of what exists upon it. But the number of people who wish to retain that diversity and the pregnant meanings within it seem to get smaller and smaller with each generation. The politicians that we have now are managers of a social system. It's quite clear that we do not have three ruling parties, but one party with three wings, the nature of which are interchangeable in relation to gender, where you come from in the country, class, background, how you were educated, and whether you arrived in the country as a newcomer in the last 40 to 50 years or not. Now, Eberle's step back from what has made the modern world leads to certain radical conclusions about it, which are spiritually and politically aristocratic. Most people are only aware of the left-right split as it relates to a pre-immigration, slightly organic society where social class was the basis for political alignment. Bourgeois, centre-right, conservatism of some sort, centre-left, Labour, social democratic, trade unionist, and so on. Now we have a racial intermedley that it complicates even that division. The distinction between the aristocratic and upper class attitude and the bourgeois attitude, which is as pronounced as any left-right split between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, is that which Eberle advocates. Eberle believes in some respects in masters and slaves, or certainly serfs. He believes that the merchant and those who deal purely with economics have to be subordinated to politics, to higher politics, to metapolitics, to military struggle. He believes that the warrior and the religious leader and the farmer and the intellectual stroke scholar stroke craftsman artist are uniquely superior to those that make money. And nearly all of Eberle's views are in some ways a form of aristocraticism in a way. If you look at all of the sports that he favours, fencing, mountaineering, they all involve lone individuals who prepare themselves for a task which is usually dangerous and which can usually result, mountaineering for example, and his book Speculation on the Peaks, in annihilation, and creates, if you go wrong, but it creates an extraordinary and ecstatic self-overbecoming if you conquer K2 as a Peruvian mountain, the Eiger, the Mount Everest, and so on. And even in the more populist forms of mountaineering, the sort of bearded upper middle class, Chris Bonington sort of cheery mountaineering, as you might call it, there is a streak of aristocratic, devil-may-care and Byronic license. The bourgeois view is, why do that? It's dangerous, it's pitiless, you can be hurt and injured, there is no profit, it serves no reason than itself. For Eberle, the reason and the purpose is the reason to do it. It is the stages that you go through and the stages you get into as you prepare and you execute a task which is dangerous. And the same analogy can be extended to martial combat. The same analogy can be extended to sports like ancient wrestling. Modern wrestling is a circus, of course. Actually decided by the middlemen who negotiate the bouts between clowns who can still damage each other very severely. But ancient wrestling was a bout that ended very quickly, and which was essentially religious, which is why the area that they wrestled in was purified with salt in most of the major traditions, and so on. Fencing. Take away the protective gloves and gear and you have gladiatorial combat. between people who are virtually on the brink of life and death. And these are the sorts of, only one step removed, even from Olympics fencing. It's noticed that in the contemporary Olympics, a movement that was founded in modernity on the Grecian ideal, nearly always founded by aristocrats, all of the early victors in shooting and fencing and all these early sports are aristocrats. Of course, the early Olympics have their funny side. Many of the female athletes that won early Olympic competitions were transsexuals. Of course, medical checks were instituted to prevent hermaphrodites and people of diverse genders and that sort of thing from competing in these competitions. But the individualistic sports in a mass age have been disprivileged and are largely regarded as strange wonderland sports that the masses only flip channels over in relation to the Olympics. For a man like Evola, and for the sensibility which he represents, things like sport are not a diversion. They are targets for initiation in relation to processes of understanding about self, the other, and life that transcend the moment. So one bout leads to another moment of skill. It's as if these moments, which most people always strive to avoid rather than engage upon, are in slow motion. The whole point of Evola's attitude towards these and other matters is to go beyond that which exists in a manner which is upwards and transcendent in its portending direction. This is a society which always looks downwards. What will other people think? What will one's neighbours think? What will people out there think? What will this BBC audience think? What do the masses, left, right, centre, pressing their buttons and consoles think? The sort of Evolian response is that what they think is of no importance. And they ought to think what the aristocrats of the world, in accordance with the traditions which are largely religious, out of which their social order comes, thinks. You can understand that this is an attitude which has not endeared this type of thinking to contemporary pundits and to the world as it now is. It's also inevitable that when Evola's books were published, they would enter the English-speaking world via the occult, via mysticism, via various types of initiated and individualistic religiosity. The whole point about the Western occult, whether one believes in the literal formulation that these people spout, or whether one believes in it metaphorically and quasi-subjectively, is that it's an individualistic form of religiosity. In simple terms, mass religion involves a small clerisy or priesthood, in the old Catholic sense, up there, and the laity are down there, and it's in Latin, medieval Latin, it's slightly mysterious. You partly understand it if you're grammar school educated, otherwise you don't. It's mysterious and semi-initiated, but you don't really know. The mystery is part of the wonder of the thing. You look up at them, and they've got their back to you, and they're looking up further beyond them, towards the divine, as they perceive it. Now that's a traditional form of mass religiosity, if you like. But the type of religiosity with which he was concerned was individualistic and voltaic, and is essentially the idea that everyone in a small group is a priest. Sometimes is a priest and a warrior combined. One of the many scandals that we have in modernity is crimes that are committed by members of various religious groups and organisations. Many traditionalist-minded people believe that the reporting of these crimes in the mass media is deliberately exaggerated by any retrospectively traditional elements of a prior and metaphysically conservative type in the society. But if one looks at it another way, and one of the things about Evola is the creativeness of the aristocratic mind that looks at essentially centrist and bourgeois problems in a completely different perspective. He would say about those sorts of scandals, which I won't belabor people with because everyone knows about them, that it's the absence of the dialectic between the priest, somebody who believes in something, somebody who believes in a philosophy that isn't just theirs and therefore relates to a society and relates to a continuing generic tradition out of which they come. Most contemporary philosophies are just my view as a tiny little atom, rather than my view as something that's concentric and links me to something larger and which can therefore be socially efficacious. But from an Evolian perspective, the absence of the warrior or the martial and soldierly traditions and its interconnection with belief and the individual who believes is the reason for decadence or deconstruction or devilment or decay in these religious organizations. In his way of looking at things, there's a seamlessness between the poet artist, the warrior, and the religious believer. They're different formulations of the same sort of thing because they're always looking upwards, and in a way are deeply individualistic and egotistical, but transcend that. Because the concentration on oneself, on one's own thinking, one's own feeling, one's own concerns, one's own attitude towards this mountain, this woman, this fight, this text, is conditioned by that which you come out of and move towards. Evola doesn't believe in progress, nor does the tradition that he comes out of. They don't believe in scientific progress, they don't believe in evolution, but his anti-evolutionism is strange and interesting. It's got nothing, or enormous nothing, to do with creationism and with, if you like, the evangelical politics of certain parts of what you might call the Puritan American right, for example. His attitude is a reverse attitude, which in a strange way is an involuntary and inegalitarian way of looking at the same issue. His view is that the apes are descended from us as we go upwards, rather than we are descended from them as we leave them in their simian animalism. So in a way, it's actually a reformulation of the same idea, but looking upwards and always seeing, if you like, the snobbish, the aristocratic, the prevailing, the overarching view, rather than viewing the thing from a mass, generic and middling perspective, which includes people. Tony Blair says the worst vice anyone can have is to be intolerant, is to be exclusive, is to exclude people. The nature of Britishness is inclusion, when of course the nature of any group identity is exclusion. And who is on the boundary, and who can be allowed in, and the subtleties and grains of difference that exist between one group and another, where one tendency of man ends. Evola believes, in a very controversial way, that decline is morphic and spiritual combined. In other words, races of man have a spiritual dimension, have a higher emotional dimension, have a psychological dimension, but never forget that Evola is not a Nietzschean. He is not somebody who believes it's all at this level. He believes that the gods speak to man, that God speaks to man directly and indirectly, and the civilizations that we come out of are based essentially on religious premises. Moderns who sneer at these sorts of attitudes, of course, forget that virtually every civilization that mankind has ever had, until relatively recently, and every civilization, the old documents and artifacts of which are included in the storehouse of the British Museum, just over there in central London, were religiously and theologically based. It's only really in a post-Enlightenment, late Scottish Enlightenment, English Enlightenment, French Enlightenment, 18th century plus sort of a way, that the secularization of Western Europe rivals the rest of the planet. Further east in Europe, less of it. Further south in Europe, a bit less of it. Religiosity on most of the other continents of the earth is still a primary force, but Evola would despise the sort of religiosity that prevails there, because he would see in it broken down thinking, syncretism. The people who would say he would be in favour of contemporary Saudi Arabia, for example, would probably be sorely disappointed. He would see, under the religious police, under the strict observance of this or that rule, American satellite dishes and modern devices, and that which is external and which has been internal in relation to modernity and which has been internally accepted. So Evola is always the critic, if you like, and always on the outside. Now his career is quite complicated, because when he was a very young man,